Hercule Poirot and the Key That Opened the Air Chapter 1, The Lady of the Non-Existent Painting. It was a particularly serene morning on the Cornish coast, the sky barely covered by a faint mist that seemed undecided whether to rise or stay and contemplate the landscape. The sea wind whispered faintly, as if afraid to disturb the peace of the majestic Bayswater Hall, a Georgian-fronted manor house that seemed frozen in another era. Its halls exuded an antique, almost theatrical elegance. And that same air of solemnity would be shattered in just a few hours by an event as strange as it was disturbing. The owner, Lady Euphemia Rosendale, was a woman in her late 70s, slim, erect, and with a voice that brooked no reply. Her fortune stemmed from the lineage of her late husband, Sir Alaric Rosendale, a maritime magnate who had made his fortune selling clockworks in Singapore and Marseille. Euphemia had lived alone since the death of her only son, Julian, who had tragically disappeared in the Mediterranean 5 years earlier. However, the house was far from quiet. Also living there were her niece Caroline, a young woman of contradictory temperament, the new estate secretary, an enigmatic Mr. Blaine, and the town doctor, Samuel Renton, who tended to visit far too frequently for a healthy woman's needs. That morning, Mrs. Rosendale had given strict instructions that no one was to enter the east drawing-room, a room containing her most valuable collection of Victorian miniatures and reliquaries. But it was in this very drawing-room, with its walls covered in dusty tapestries and an atmosphere heavy with the past, that Lady Matilda, arriving with 11 o'clock tea, found her mistress slumped in front of a portrait that, by all accounts, had never existed. The painting depicted a young woman with a serene but defiant gaze, wearing a 19th-century blue dress and a small golden key hanging from her neck. The strangest thing wasn't the style of the painting, nor its clearly ancient technique. The strangest thing was that no one in the house, not even Euphemia herself during her lifetime, remembered ever having seen it. And even more surprising was what was found when the canvas was removed, a built-in safe behind it, completely open. The doctor certified that Euphemia Rosendale had died of a heart attack. But Dr. Renton, when questioned by the local police, did not hide his doubts. "She was not a sickly woman," he said. "She was in perfect condition last week." Caroline, the niece, cried out in despair that this could not have been natural. Blaine, the secretary, simply nodded impenetrably. The safe was empty. There was no sign of a forced entry, no forced key, no broken lock. Only a small note inside, written in brown ink on a piece of old paper, in elegant handwriting. "The air opens not with violence, but with silence." It was then, when the county police found themselves without leads, without a logical explanation, and faced with a tight circle of people all with something to hide, that Caroline, in the midst of her grief, wrote a letter. It was a short letter, written in haste, but with urgent clarity. Its recipient was a man whose little grey cells had solved even more improbable enigmas. 3 days later, Hercule Poirot, accompanied by his unwavering leather suitcase and his perfectly symmetrical tie, stepped off the train at Trentwith Station. A dead woman in front of a painting that doesn't exist, and a safe that opens by itself. Poirot murmured with an inquisitive gleam in his eyes, "My dear, this case promises to be fascinating." And so the mystery of the key that opened the air, it began, not with an obvious crime, but with a death that could not be explained, and a key that seemed to open not doors, but secrets. Chapter 2. The Hall of Absences. The coastal wind had picked up when Hercule Poirot appeared at the great door of Bayswater Hall, dressed in his usual dark wool coat and perfectly placed bowler hat. The detective was greeted by a butler, with a composed expression and a uniform as immaculate as his composure. His name was Crayton, and his voice had the discreet resonance of someone who has spent decades in the service of decorum. "Welcome, Monsieur Poirot. Miss Caroline is waiting for you in the music room." Poirot nodded without speaking, his eyes, already moving, scanning every visible corner of the hall. Not in search of evidence, but to feel the pulse of the place. Time, like a layer of antique varnish, seemed to have stopped its course there. Somewhat worn Persian carpets, heavy curtains, a grandfather clock that solemnly struck the hour, as if each chime were a warning. Upon reaching the music room, Caroline stood up quickly. She was a young woman of about 28, with light-coloured eyes but surrounded by a premature weariness. She was dressed in black, though not excessively so, and her manner of speaking revealed a mixture of firmness and restrained nerves. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming. I needed someone who wouldn't accept the first logical answer. Logic, mademoiselle, is often misunderstood," he replied with a faint smile, sitting down with careful calculation. "Tell me, why exactly did you write to me?" Caroline sighed and looked out the window, as if she needed to get away from the scene itself. "Because my aunt wouldn't have died like that. Because someone inside this house, he's playing with us. Because that painting was never hanging there. And yet it was. And that key, what key? The one the woman in the portrait was wearing. We all saw it. Small gold, barely the size of a thimble. But then the painting disappeared." Poirot frowned slightly. "Did he disappear?" "Yes. The county deputies found him, hanging as always. Only it wasn't the same one. It was a different one. A still life, fruit and a glass of wine. No one but Matilda and I saw the woman." Poirot remained silent for a few seconds. "And the safe?" "Empty, except for the note." Caroline walked to a small lacquered table, opened a marquetry box, and took out an envelope. Inside, carefully arranged, was the note with the cryptic message. Poirot took it between his fingers and examined it in detail. Not because of its contents, which undoubtedly intrigued him, but because of the texture of the paper, the slightly faded ink, the way the sheet had been folded. "Can I see the Oriental room?" Minutes later, Crayton led them down a quiet hallway to a carved wooden double door. As they opened it, a faint scent of camphor and varnish wafted into the air. The Oriental room was an eclectic mix of exotic furniture, Chinese screens, Murano, glass lamps and display cases of reliquaries. Poirot moved forward slowly, as if strolling through the memories of someone who had collected symbols rather than emotions. He stopped in front of the wall where, according to Caroline, the painting had once been. In its place hung the aforementioned still life, signed, curiously, by a certain Graham Mallory, closed 1897. Was this the one that was hanging before? Yes, interrupted Blaine's deep voice, which had just entered unannounced. It's always been there. It's one of Grandpa Rosendale's originals. Lady Euphemia would never have replaced it." Poirot looked at him carefully. The secretary was a man in his 40s, with grey eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, and an air of excessive calm. He carried a leather notebook under his arm, and seemed to fear neither death nor detectives. "And you were in the house when it happened?" "I was in the library, preparing the documentation for the inheritance archive." "Can I see this documentation?" "Of course, although I don't think it has anything to do with what happened." Mrs. Rosendale hadn't made any recent changes to her will. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "But finally, sir, the absence of change can sometimes be a more revealing change." With a murmur of assent, Blaine led Poirot into the library, but the detective had already noticed something else. A small crack in the wall, just below the picture frame. Barely perceptible, but there, as if something had been inserted or removed. In the library, Poirot leafed through the documents without much expression. Detailed legacies, percentages, old clauses. But one name caught his eye. Julian Rosendale. He had officially died 5 years earlier. Yet his testamentary section had not been amended. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "Very curious." Returning to the living room, Poirot stopped in front of the fireplace. He looked at the fire carefully, and then at the small clock on the mantelpiece. It stood at 11:07. How long has this clock not worked? "Since the day she died," Matilda said, coming in with a tea tray. She stopped just as the scream rang out. "I swear to the Virgin." Poirot narrowed his eyes. The air was beginning to thicken, as if the house itself concealed secrets in every seam. There was still no death confirmed as a murder, nor any formal suspects. But one thing was clear to him. There was a deliberate absence, and absences, when Poirot investigated, spoke louder than any testimony. Chapter 3. Keys that don't open doors. The next day the sky had turned slate grey. The mist lay over the coast like a thick, damp blanket, enveloping Bayswater Hall. A twilight that accentuated his air of an enigma frozen in time. Hercule Poirot, punctual as a metronome, was already awake, dressed, and intently observing the garden from the window of his guest room. With a small notebook in hand, he had written down a single word: intention. It wasn't the painting, the safe, or even the note that intrigued Poirot most. It was the gesture behind it all. The fact that someone had planted a non-existent painting and made it disappear without a trace, that the safe was open, but it was impossible to confirm whether someone had taken something or simply opened a loophole. And above all, the note, written with the air of someone toying with the very concept of crime. At 9 o'clock, Poirot asked to meet with all the inhabitants. "Of the house in the greenhouse. I just want to chat. Nothing formal, mes amis," he said with a courtesy that barely veiled his scrutinizing gaze. Plants help oxygenate ideas. The greenhouse was a glass dome, covered with moss in some corners. Inside, jasmine and orchids hung among ancient ferns, and the air smelled of earth and steam. There they were. Caroline, pale but firm. Blaine, always restrained. Dr. Renton, somewhat uncomfortable at being dragged from his office. And Matilda, the maid, her hands clasped tightly beneath her apron. Poirot began with a simple question. Who had access to the eastern room without asking permission? "Not me," Caroline replied instantly. "Aunt kept that room locked for months. Not even Matilda could get in without her permission." "I only came in when Lady Euphemia told me to," the maid said, her voice trembling, "to dust the glass cabinets and clean the candlesticks." "And where was the key to that room?" "On his personal chain," Blaine replied. "He always wore it around his neck. An antique bronze key, very ornate." Poirot nodded slowly. "And that key was found?" An awkward silence followed the question. Matilda was the one who answered, looking down. "No, sir, she wasn't wearing it when we found her. It wasn't in her bedroom or her jewellery box either," Caroline added. "We looked for it with the police. It disappeared." "Like the portrait," said Poirot in a low voice. Dr. Renton, who had remained silent, decided to intervene. "With respect, Monsieur Poirot, I still believe it was a natural death. Lady Euphemia's heart was in good condition, but she was not young. Any strong emotional shock could have—" Poirot interrupted him with a slight inclination of his head. "Of course, Doctor, the nature of the death has not yet been determined, but if I may observe, isn't it more disturbing to receive a coded message in the form of an unknown painting, accompanied by an open safe and a key around the neck of a painted figure?" The doctor didn't know what to answer. "Could someone have broken into that unlocked safe?" asked Poirot. "Not without tools," Blaine said with certainty. "It's an older model, but sturdy. The only way would have been with the combination, or the key." Poirot then approached Matilda. "When you brought the tea that morning, was the door ajar?" "Yes, sir, just a little." "As if someone had left in a hurry." "And the portrait? Can you describe it again?" "Of course. She was a young woman with her hair pulled back, wearing a sky-blue dress. Very old-fashioned. But her eyes, sir, they were cold. They impressed me so much that I dropped the tray. And the key? She wore it hanging from a ribbon, right in the centre of her chest." Poirot was silent for a few seconds. Then he turned to Blaine. "Do you know of any similar portrait in family history?" "No," the secretary said, barely hesitating, "although there was a story, a legend more like. It told of a cursed painting. A woman who swore an oath to a lover killed in the war. It was said the portrait had been removed by Grandfather Rosendale because it brought misfortune." Caroline looked at him in amazement. "Why did you never mention that?" "Because there's no record that such a painting ever existed," Caroline replied. "It was just children's stories, the whispers of old employees." Poirot put a hand to his moustache, thoughtful. "And yet the painting appeared. It was seen, and then it disappeared. How curious." He gathered them all together one last time, with a phrase that left the greenhouse in suspense. "My friends, this isn't a crime of opportunity. It's a crime of intent. Someone didn't just want to kill, but to sow doubt, confusion, an act designed to break logic." And then he looked at each one intensely. "The key has disappeared, but it wasn't a key that opened a door, but a memory. And I assure you, someone here knows very well the lock that key opened." Poirot left the greenhouse without waiting for a reply. Dew had condensed on the glass, and at the end of the corridor, next to an unlit oil lamp, a grandfather clock struck 11 o'clock. Again. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Library, The day glided slowly over Bayswater Hall, as if time itself were reluctant to reveal what lay hidden within its walls. Hercule Poirot, after a Spartan breakfast of soft-boiled eggs and crisp toast, asked to spend the morning in the library. "An orderly mind needs an orderly environment, isn't it?" he had said with a slight smile to the butler Creighton. The library was a long room, panelled in dark wood, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the eastern garden. The shelves, dusty at the top, were filled with volumes dealing with lineages, maritime law, classical philosophy, and the Rosendales' personal correspondence. Poirot was not interested in the actual contents of the books, but in the gaps. The place where were missing books, where nervous hands had acted in silence. Found one. An empty space between two leather-bound volumes, right in one of the lowest sections. The dust indicated that something had been removed not long ago. Poirot bent down and examined the edge. Then he looked in the collection index. "Ah," he muttered, "Captain Rosendale's log, 1912-1915. Missing." Blaine's voice surprised him but didn't startle him. That notebook was removed by Lady Euphemia herself a few weeks ago. She asked me to take it to her bedroom. And for what reason? She said she wanted to reread it. Her husband, Sir Alaric, wrote it during his early trading voyages in the Îles au Levant. It apparently contained references to her great-grandmother. Poirot sat up slowly, his eyes half closed. And was it related to the portrait? "I couldn't say," Blaine replied measuredly. "Though she did mention a female figure, yes, a certain Elspeth Marston, a woman who, according to family legend, closed the heart of the house after a love affair. Euphemia had been obsessing over that story lately." Poirot walked to the library fireplace and noticed a locket embedded in the mantelpiece. A miniature with two barely visible initials, E.M., and a tiny key painted in filigree above the neckline of the portrait. "This image, did you see it before the painting appeared?" "Yes," Blaine replied. "Mrs. Rosendale said she was the closest thing to Elsbeth, although no one could confirm her veracity." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He touched the locket's frame, examined it closely, and noticed something. A small spring hidden in the base. He pressed it with the tip of his pen, and the frame creaked slightly before opening forward, revealing a tiny back compartment. Inside, carefully rolled up, was a sheet of tracing paper. As they unfolded it, Blaine and Poirot read together a sentence written in very old-fashioned handwriting. "Where the heir is enclosed, there the heritage sleeps." "Inheritance?" Blaine murmured. "What kind of inheritance?" Poirot didn't reply. He carefully closed the frame and put the note among his belongings. Then he looked at it carefully. "Monsieur Blaine, you are a meticulous man, perhaps as much as I am. Do you keep records of Lady Euphemia's recent movements around the house?" "I have her activity diary, of course. She wrote down almost everything. Bring it to me, please. And also a list of house keys, original and duplicate." Blaine left with a slight bow. Poirot, alone, reflected. The disappearance of the painting and the royal key were not separate incidents. Someone had recreated a scene to provoke a specific reaction in Euphemia, an act of suggestion, an emotional evocation that confronted her probably with a truth she was unwilling to face. Shortly after, Blaine returned with 2 items: a blue cloth-bound notebook and a key inventory. Poirot sat down at the desk and began reading. The entries were written in strong, careful handwriting, but somewhat nervous in the more recent dates. A note from April 14th caught his attention. "I dreamed about Elsbeth. She said the air would open again. I mustn't ignore it this time. Blaine wouldn't understand, nor would Caroline. And then, on April 18th, I've seen the portrait in my dreams 3 nights in a row. Maybe it was always there. Where is the key? Where did Alaric hide the lock?" Poirot slowly closed the notebook. A woman who begins to see a painting in her dreams, and then sees it hanging. Is this a hallucination, or a carefully planned manipulation? He quickly scanned the key inventory. The originals were kept in a sealed chest in Blaine's office. The copies were in the butler's custody. Only one figure, according to the document, didn't have a copy. The key to the north attic marked as lost since 1928, closed since then. Poirot pointed to the note. What's in that attic? Old boxes, dust, forgotten memories. It hasn't been opened in decades. Poirot stood up. Then maybe it's time to shake off some of that dust, my friend. Because in this house, the forgotten tends to reappear. Sometimes, in the form of death. Chapter 5. The sealed attic. The north attic referred to in the inventory was at the end of a narrow corridor covered by a threadbare carpet in the oldest part of the building. Bayswater Hall. The door was made of dark oak, with rusty hinges and a dusty lock. A half-corroded copper sign still stood out. Do not open. Private property. Poirot, wearing gloves, inspected the frame. The lock looked old but undamaged. No signs of forced entry. It was as if no one had tried to break in for years. Yet the mental presence of the place was almost palpable, as if the air had thickened upon arriving there. "Is there no way in without the key?" asked Caroline, who had accompanied him at the detective's request. Poirot turned to her with a slight smile. "Mademoiselle, even the most closed doors can be convinced if spoken to politely, or with a suitable lockpick." No sooner had he said this than Creighton appeared from the end of the hall, carrying a toolkit and wearing an expression that was a mixture of embarrassment and efficiency. "Much to my chagrin, sir, I have experience with old locks. Windows sometimes stick and require some creativity." Minutes later, with a soft click and a creak that sounded like a breath held back for decades, the attic door opened. The air inside was dry, heavy with dust, and choked with the smell of ancient wood and rotting fabric. Poirot went up first, followed by Caroline. The attic was a large, unfurnished room with low ceilings and exposed beams. Light traps filtered the midday mist through grime-covered skylights. At the far end, under an old tarpaulin, lay a trunk. Poirot carefully approached and removed the canvas. The trunk was sealed with a leather strap and a rusty metal clasp. With Creighton's help, they managed to open it. Inside were papers wrapped in oilcloth, a neatly folded military cloak, and a notebook covered in dark blue velvet. Caroline took it first, but Poirot raised a gentle hand. "With your permission, Mademoiselle Nerva's hands spoil the traces of the past." He opened the notebook. On the first page, an inscription, Julian Rosendale, 1919 to 1932, confidential Poirot, flicked through the pages slowly. It was a diary, one that revealed something shocking. Julian had discovered in his teens a letter hidden among his grandfather Alaric's papers, a letter from a woman named Elspeth Marston, dated 1899. In it, Elspeth claimed to be the mother of Alaric's illegitimate son and demanded the child's recognition in the line of succession. In return, she promised to remain silent forever. Julian, then just a restless young man, didn't understand the legal implications of the discovery, but his notes reflected a growing obsession with Elspeth. He described dreams, fragments of overheard conversations between his mother and Alaric, and even a passage where he claimed to have seen the portrait of the woman with the key in a sealed room. "My God," Caroline murmured, reading over Poirot's shoulder. So, Elspeth existed. "But yes," whispered Poirot, "and Euphemia may have known it all along." On a later page, Julian had pasted a child's sketch of the key, an ornamental shape with a double arch and an inscription EM below. He wrote, "I don't want this inheritance. I just want the truth. But if I die before my time, let someone follow the wind, because that's where the lock is." Poirot closed the notebook solemnly. "And Julian died in the Mediterranean, right?" he asked. Caroline nodded. "During a boating expedition with 2 other young men. The boat disappeared, and only one of them was ever found. His body was never found. It was devastating for Aunt Euphemia." Poirot nodded, but his eyes darkened with deeper thought. "And that other young man, what was his name?" Caroline hesitated. "I don't remember. He was a friend from Oxford. Wait, maybe, yes, Nicholas Renton. Could he be related to Dr. Renton?" Poirot didn't reply. He took a blank sheet of paper from his notebook and wrote 3 names: Elspeth Marston, Julian Rosendale, Dr. Samuel Renton. 3 lines, 3 beats. And in the centre, a key. One that doesn't open doors, but memories. As they descended from the attic, Poirot paused on the threshold and turned slowly. The dust had risen and swirled in soft spirals in the cold air. In the far corner, a cracked mirror hanging from a beam gave back a distorted image of Caroline and something else. A shadow. Poirot looked at her for a long time before firmly closing. "The door. Someone has manipulated the past to alter the present. And mademoiselle, when you play with air, you run the risk of suffocating the truth." Chapter 6. The Shadow of Dr. Renton. The afternoon descended slowly on Bayswater Hall, tinting. The windows are tired gold. The gardens, silent in the morning mist, now seemed frozen in time. But inside the house, the tension vibrated with suppressed force. Hercule Poirot had left the attic less than an hour before, but his mind was already moving with surgical speed. Was convinced that the mystery wasn't just about a death. It was a duel between memory and manipulation, between the truths hidden in the blood and the names someone had chosen to leave forgotten. And among all the names, one was beginning to take on a dangerous glimmer. Dr. Samuel Renton Poirot found him in the greenhouse, carefully watering a withered lavender plant. "I didn't know you grew flowers, Doctor," said Poirot gently. "It helps. With concentration," Renton replied without looking up. "In the absence of cigarettes and civilized conversation." Poirot smiled. A civilized conversation is precisely what I want. Just one question, my dear doctor. Renton looked up, his grey eyes boring into the detective's face. Did you know Julian Rosendale? A pause. Brief but sufficient. Not personally. He was a bit older than me. I know he died in the Mediterranean under tragic circumstances. Poirot nodded slowly. And yet you have the same last name as your travelling companion, Nicholas. Renton. Weren't you brothers? Renton turned off the tap. The lavender dripped slowly, as if the drops themselves refused to fall. Cousins, he finally said. But we weren't close. He was impulsive, and my family didn't approve of his lifestyle. I guess after his death, the name went back to being mine alone. And did he ever tell you about Julian? I admired him. He said I had a special talent for seeing what others couldn't, that I felt invisible around him. Poirot made a mental note of the tone. There was no sadness, no affection, just a too perfect neutrality. Do you know if Julian kept any diaries? Diary? One that mentioned a woman named Elspeth Marston. Pause. Poirot crossed his arms. Doctor, Lady Euphemia's death remains unsolved, and without physical evidence one is forced to search for answers in the crevices of memory. You, as a doctor, know what unresolved trauma can cause. Renton stiffened slightly. Are you suggesting I've hidden something? No, I'm suggesting that someone, perhaps you, knew that the image of Elspeth could have a devastating effect on the mind of a woman already troubled by the loss of her child. The doctor stepped forward. She was obsessed with ghosts, Poirot. Do you really think a portrait could have killed her? Not directly, the Belgian replied calmly. But if someone convinced her that her grandson was alive, or that Elspeth was still waiting behind a sealed door, well, my friend, can be more lethal than poison. Renton swallowed, but said nothing. Poirot nodded. Thank you for your time, Doctor. As the doctor walked away, Poirot looked at the lavender plant. Just behind the pot, something glittered. He bent down slowly and found a golden hairpin with a small inscription. He put it away, without saying a word. That evening, Poirot asked Caroline to accompany him on a thorough search of Lady Euphemia's personal belongings. Not without hesitation, she agreed. Together, they searched the chest of drawers, the sewing box, the wardrobe, and finally, the topmost drawer of the dressing table. There, among lace handkerchiefs and envelopes containing old letters, they found a flat case. Inside, carefully wrapped in blue silk, was a key. My God, Caroline whispered. It's just like the one in the portrait. Poirot held it between his fingers. It was the exact shape of the sketch in Julian's diary. Ornate, small, and judging by the rust, it hadn't been used in years. And yet, he murmured, the key was here all along. So, someone planted the fake portrait. Someone who knew this story. Who knew Euphemia would break down if she saw Elspeth again, and at the same time, who knew the real portrait had been destroyed or hidden decades ago. And who could have done that? Poirot turned the case over and noticed a signature on the inside corner. Gallery Mallory, Paris, 1897. The same name as the supposed author of the still life that now hung in its place. Not a mistake, but a meticulous replacement. One work supplanted by another at just the right moment. Only someone with access to the most intimate memories and enough time to study them. Poirot closed the case firmly, and that someone, Mademoiselle, is still in this house, watching us, waiting. Chapter 7. Under the Carpet in the Hall of Mirrors. The next morning she woke up filled with a tension that was not entirely explainable. Bayswater Hullet seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding the collective breath of its occupants. Creighton was serving breakfast more quickly than usual, and Matilda kept glancing over her shoulder as she collected the cups. Poirot, untouched by his tea, gazed out at the garden from the veranda. His thoughts danced in tight circles. Elsbeth, Julian, Renton, the portrait that existed and didn't exist. The key found in the dressing table was tangible evidence, but the crime, if it was a crime, was still unclear, because beyond the death itself there lay the most disturbing question. Why now? It was Caroline who interrupted his reflection. Monsieur Poirot, I just spoke to Creighton. He says he found something unusual in the Hall of Mirrors. The Hall of Mirrors? Poirot repeated with interest, sitting up with pinpoint precision. A room only opened on special occasions. Aunt thought it was too grand for everyday use. But last night Creighton heard something. Footsteps. And this morning one of the mirrors was broken. Poirot frowned. Curious, very curious. Please show it to me. They walked together down the east corridor, where the carpets were thicker and the air thicker. The door to the Hall of Mirrors creaked open. It was a majestic room, with pale wood-panelled walls and 5 symmetrically arranged Venetian mirrors. In the centre, a black marble table. Maroon curtains and dim lighting completed the theatrical aura of the place. One of the mirrors, the one on the far right, had a hairline crack, like a crack made by deliberate, not accidental pressure. Poirot approached, inspecting the frame. It wasn't the glass that gave way, he murmured. It was what was behind it. With Creighton's help, he carefully removed the mirror from the wall. Behind it, as he suspected, was a rectangular opening, sealed with a wooden cover that was barely distinguishable from the wall. A trapdoor. A secret compartment, Caroline whispered, holding her breath. Poirot pulled back the lid with effort. Inside was an old metal box, its edges reinforced with iron. It had no lock, only a mechanical clasp. When he opened it, the air that escaped was dry and heavy. Inside, neatly stacked, were 4 objects. A letter with the letterhead of Gallery Mallory. Paris, dated 1919, a miniature portrait of a young woman, unframed. The image, without a doubt, was the one in the painting Matilda had described a few days earlier. A broken chain with a gold clasp, without the key. An envelope sealed with red wax, with the initials Noir Poirot, first took out the letter and read it silently. Then he handed the portrait to Caroline, who looked at it reverently. "It's her," he said. "It's Elsbeth. It's not possible, but it is." Poirot opened the envelope with extreme care. Inside was a letter written in Euphemia Rosendale's own hand. Her handwriting was firm, but the ink revealed an unusual urgency. "Anyone finds this, it's because I haven't had the courage to reveal the truth." Julian discovered things I never should have hidden. Elspeth existed. She was real. And the shame I felt, learning that Alaric fathered a child out of wedlock, consumed me more than any loss. I hid the painting. I replaced the key with a decorative copy, and I convinced Julian to keep quiet, but he couldn't. The weight of it sickened him. He went on that trip to free himself. He never returned, and I never stopped listening to her. Elsbeth, in the halls, in the paintings, in my dreams. Caroline covered her mouth with both hands. So, my aunt knew that her husband had another child, and he hid it, Poirot said, in the hope of preserving the legacy. But secrets, mademoiselle, they have a graceful way of re-emerging, when you least expect it. Poirot examined the contents of the box one last time. Then his attention returned to a small detail that had gone unnoticed. The back of the portrait. It bore a mark, Mallory 1897. Copy requested by R.R. Caroline asked. Renton, said Poirot in a low voice. The puzzle was taking shape. Someone knew about the portrait's existence. They knew about the contents of the attic. They knew about the key. And they had known exactly how to manipulate everything to provoke a devastating psychological reaction in Euphemia. But one piece was still missing. Caroline, said Poirot, turning slowly towards her. Can you tell me if your aunt has been suffering from hallucinations in recent months? I don't know. She talked to herself more. She said she heard footsteps, old laughter. Sometimes we thought it was age or guilt. Poirot nodded gravely. So, it's time to find out who fueled those voices. He turned to Creighton. Please gather everyone in the main hall this afternoon. I've seen enough. And as he walked back to his room, Poirot clutched Euphemia's letter to his chest, not out of tenderness, but because guilt rarely acts alone, and in Bayswater Hall. Someone else had pushed the door that Euphemia did not dare to open. Chapter 8. The Voice That Was Never Heard. The main hall of Bayswater Hollet was dimly lit when the inhabitants gathered that afternoon. The oil lamps cast a barely warm light on the wood-panelled walls and the portraits of ancestors which, from their gilded frames, seemed to gaze at those present with increasing intensity. Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. To his left, Caroline remained silent, visibly agitated. Opposite them, seated in a semicircular arrangement, were Dr. Renton, Blaine the secretary, Matilda the maid, and Creighton the butler. No one spoke. The air was thick with anticipation. Poirot looked up and began, with the controlled calm of someone who already knows the structure of the crime, but has yet to weave the complete plot before his audience. My friends, over the past few days, I have examined not only the objects, the letters, and the hidden spaces of this house, but also its emotions, its unspoken words, its silences. Because a crime is not just the act, it is the intention, the emotion, the memory. Everyone watched him without blinking. Mrs. Euphemia Rosendale didn't die of natural causes alone. She was driven, emotionally pushed to the brink, with surgical precision, by someone who knew her history, her fears, and the power of her unresolved past. Blaine narrowed his eyes. Are you suggesting that someone manipulated her to death? Yes, not with poison, not with a gun, but with the echo of unatoned guilt. with symbols that made her doubt her sanity, an impossible portrait, a key that didn't open physical doors but memories, and a note written with the elegance of someone who wishes to be seen as intelligent, not as a murderer. Matilda crossed herself softly. Poirot walked slowly to the desk. "I found the original portrait of Elsbeth. Also Euphemia's letter, in which she confesses to having suppressed all evidence of Elsbeth and her illegitimate child's existence out of shame. Her grandson Julian knew this secret, and he wanted to reveal it, but he was dissuaded, silenced." Renton shifted in his seat. Dissuaded by whom? Poirot turned to him. By someone who knew full well of Julian's emotional weakness, who convinced him that the truth would destroy his family. Someone who then, years later, used that knowledge to destroy Euphemia as well. Renton pressed his lips together. "And you're suggesting that someone is me?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Doctor. I affirm it. Because you were the one who treated Euphemia for years. Because your cousin Nicholas Renton was one of the only ones who knew of Julian's final journey. And because you, coincidentally, became the silent confidant of the house. Always present, always available." Blaine turned to Renton in surprise. "What? You knew about Elsbeth?" Poirot held up a golden hairpin. "This one was found in the greenhouse, behind a flower pot. It has the initials M. Only someone who wanted to recreate Elsbeth in Euphemia's mind would put in these kinds of details." "That doesn't prove anything," Renton replied firmly. Poirot smiled slightly. "We also know that the copy of the painting was secretly commissioned months ago by a man who signed R. in Gallery Mallory, Paris. Same last name as yours. And you admitted to having relatives in Europe, right?" Caroline intervened, her voice choked. "Did you plan it all from the beginning?" Renton stood up. "No, I just wanted her to remember what she did, what she kept quiet. I didn't think her heart wouldn't be able to handle it. But you did know that confrontation could damage her," Poirot replied in a low voice, without judgment, only truth. "And yet you arranged every detail. The forged letter, the painting, the note in the safe. You were the architect of a crime without traces, but not without intent." An icy silence fell over the room. "And why?" Caroline asked. "What did you gain from this?" Renton looked down. His voice came out hoarse. "Because she erased my family. Because her pride killed Elsbeth and turned Julian into a martyr of silence. I grew up knowing that my grandfather, Alaric's illegitimate son, was treated like a shadow, as if he'd never existed. I just wanted her to remember, to feel what it's like to live with a ghost." Poirot sighed, his expression unperturbed. "And so, Doctor, you became the echo of that shadow, and in the final irony, the one who always wanted to be heard will end up silenced." Creighton silently went outside to call the police. Poirot finally sat down, calmly crossing his legs. Elsbeth's voice was never heard in life, but her image, her memory, and her key opened more than a door. They opened the air itself, and with it the truth. Chapter 9. Where the Inheritance Dwells. Samuel Renton's arrest was not noisy. In fact, it happened with an efficiency that almost seemed rehearsed. 2 county constables arrived at dusk, following a direct call from Poirot. Renton, although upset and pale, did not resist. He simply asked for a few minutes to gather his belongings and said goodbye to Bayswater Hall. With a dry phrase, "I didn't want to kill anyone, just give back a face to someone who'd lost it." But although the doctor had been unmasked, for Poirot, the case had not yet reached its final resolution. The crime had been exposed, yes, but not understood completely. And the Belgian detective knew well that a crime without its root discovered was like a forced lock, useful for a moment, but broken forever. That evening Poirot asked to be alone in the library. He sat in front of the fire, Julian Rosendale's diary on his knees, Euphemia's letter at his side. On the table lay 3 objects that, until then, had seemed symbolic: the small golden key, Elspeth's hairpin, and the miniature portrait. He turned them slowly between his fingers like chess pieces. One phrase kept echoing in his mind: where the air is enclosed, there the heritage sleeps. What had Julian meant with that phrase? Was it merely a metaphor? A poetic line written out of frustration? Or, as Poirot suspected, was it a literal statement? With a quick gesture, the detective stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and crossed the house toward the Oriental Hall. There, in the same corner where the original painting had hung, now missing, he re-examined the crack in the wall he'd noticed days before, this time more intensely. He touched at the lower plinth and gently pressed the wooden planks. A sharp click responded. The section of wall caved in slightly, revealing a secret compartment larger than expected. Inside was an iron box, lockless, but with a design so ancient it looked like something out of a Gothic novel. With effort, Poirot opened it. Inside were 3 sealed envelopes, each with a name: Julian Rosendale. Caroline Rosendale Cornwall, Historical Institute. And in the background, folder marked with old handwriting: Elsbeth Marston's Legacy, Testamentary Acknowledgement. Poirot examined them silently. The contents were clear and devastating. Julian, before leaving on his final journey, had prepared a complete package to reveal the legal existence of Alaric Rosendale's illegitimate son and claim his rights. Euphemia had undoubtedly found this box and decided to hide it again. Perhaps she intended to reveal it later. Perhaps she was afraid to do so. But she never dared. Poirot solemnly closed the box. The air inside smelled of old paper, but also of closure, of something that had been trying to be heard for years. The next morning, Poirot met Caroline in the conservatory. He delicately handed her Julian's folder. "Mademoiselle, this is the true inheritance. Not just his family's fortune, but the history his blood tried to deny. The past doesn't forgive forgetting. And his uncle Julian, in the end, was braver than all of them." Caroline flipped through the contents with tears in her eyes. Her face went from shock to understanding, and then to something deeper: respect. Should I make this information public? Poirot inclined his head. "That, mademoiselle. It's a decision only you can make, but remember, not every legacy is weighty. Some are liberating." That evening, Poirot packed his suitcase. Creighton, as always, fastened each buckle with ceremonial perfection. Before leaving, Poirot walked around the hall one last time. He looked at the portraits of the Rosendales, each looking from a different century, with the same motionless haughtiness. Then he looked at the niche where Elspeth's portrait had been, and smiled. The key was never for a lock, but for a memory, he murmured. And now, finally, the air has been opened, and with his shoes perfectly polished, and his walking stick in his hand, Hercule Poirot left Bayswater Hall, leaving behind a less silent house, a less broken family, and a past finally acknowledged. Chapter 10. The Last Key. The rain had returned to Bayswater Hall, not with fury, but with the same melancholy that was now creeping into the walls of the mansion. Hercule Poirot, still staying one last night courtesy of Caroline, was in the music room, a place he had previously overlooked. The piano notes lay dormant, covered by a linen sheet, as if no one had dared to touch it since Lady Euphemia's death. But Poirot, without music, heard other melodies, those of unspoken words, those of hidden symbols. Across from him, Caroline slowly sipped a cup of tea. Her eyes, though tired, were no longer clouded by fear or uncertainty. She had spent the afternoon organizing the documents Julian had hidden with the help of the county notary. The story Euphemia had been afraid to tell was now beginning to be heard. "I've decided to send them to the Historical Institute," he said, suddenly. "Elspeth's entire file, Julian's letter, even the portrait. The family doesn't need any more secrets. Just room for the truth." Poirot nodded, satisfied. "Very well done, mademoiselle. It's not about what is lost, but what one leaves in order. Your aunt, though misguided, sought to protect, but you have chosen to liberate. That is nobler." Caroline was silent for a few seconds. "And you, Monsieur Poirot, do you think she knew Renton was manipulating her?" "Not at first," he said gently. "But perhaps in your final days you sensed it, and instead of facing it, you stuffed the past back into your mind. Only this time you couldn't bear the weight. The mind, mademoiselle, can be more fragile than the heart." The wind whistled outside, and for a moment they both stood in silence, listening to the branches gently tapping against the glass. It was then that Poirot took a small, velvet-wrapped object from his coat, the golden key that had appeared on Euphemia's boudoir. "The last one?" Caroline asked. "Yes, but it doesn't open a lock. It opens something more important." He offered her, the key. Caroline held it as if afraid of breaking it. "And what do I do with this?" Poirot smiled. "Keep it, not as a symbol of what was hidden, but of what was revealed. This key represents a truth that no one else could force, only discover. Like all truths, it came at a price, but now it belongs to the future." She looked at him tenderly. Poirot, moved by her dignity, stood up. "I'm leaving tomorrow. I have an appointment with Mr. Hastings in London. He's promised to take me to a new restaurant that, according to him, serves the best lamb stew in England." "Bah, I doubt it. But it will be a nice distraction." "What if he ever returns to Cornwall?" Poirot tilted his head. "Maybe, but I'd rather not do it as a detective. Maybe as a tourist, maybe even as a retired writer. Although I doubt it. The little grey cells don't know how to stay still." They both laughed softly. Caroline approached and gave him a short but sincere hug. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. not for solving the crime, but for giving me back my family history, without the need for revenge." Poirot stared at her. "Mademoiselle, in crimes of memory, the greatest punishment is not imposed by the law, but by conscience, and yours has survived unscathed." The next day, when Creighton carried his suitcase to the car, Poirot said goodbye with his usual gesture, a slight movement of his hat and an almost theatrical bow. From the back seat of the taxi, as the car pulled away along the leafy path, Poirot took one last look at the house. In one of the upper floor windows, he thought he saw a figure, a dark-haired woman dressed in blue, who wasn't really there. Poirot closed his eyes. "Elsbeth, finally, your voice has been heard." And so ended the case of the key that opened the air. Not with a gunshot or a violent confession, but with the most invisible of crimes, one built on what is left unspoken, on denied memories, and on the truths that, finally, dare to breathe. End chapter 11. The House That Learned to Listen. Days after Poirot's departure, Bayswater Hall, she breathed with a different rhythm, not faster, but more conscious, as if the walls, once shrunken by the weight of untold secrets, had stretched out again under the Cornish sun. The drizzle was no longer lament. It was cleansing, purging, useful silence. Caroline Rosendale had taken official residence as the sole heir to Euphemia's legacy. Although more than a mansion and a fortune, what she truly felt she had received was an unfinished story, a testimony that she now had to guard and correct. Elsbeth's portrait had been carefully restored and delivered as promised to the Cornwall Historical Institute. Along with it, Caroline included Julian's letters, diary, and a handwritten note that read simply, "This house has been silent for a century. Let others now listen." It wasn't signed with a name, just an initial C, but despite the slowly returning order, a subtle unease lingered in the most intimate corners of the house. The north attic, locked again, seemed to make a faint creak every time the wind rose, and in the Hall of Mirrors, where the box containing Elsbeth's legacy had been hidden, Matilda swore that every night she heard footsteps when no one was walking. One morning, Creighton, the butler, approached Caroline as she was inspecting the old rooms in the west wing. He was carrying a tray with a note on it. "Excuse me, miss," he said with his characteristic calm. "This came in the mail this morning. There's no return address, just a white envelope with your name on it." Caroline took the letter cautiously. The handwriting was small, elegant and sloping, very different from her aunt's, very different from any hand she recognized. "Miss Rosendale, the truth, even when revealed, is never erased. It only changes form. I say goodbye, not with bitterness, but with respect. Samuel Renton." The letter was accompanied by a small photograph. It featured 3 smiling young men, Julian, Nicholas Renton, and a third, unidentified boy. The back of the photo read, "Marseille, 1931, before leaving." Caroline held the picture in her hands for a long time. The past, as Poirot had said, doesn't disappear. It just changes clothes. It settles into the cracks of the present, waiting to be heard. That afternoon, as he walked through the central gallery, he stopped in front of the place where the fake still life had once hung. Now, the wall was empty, white, not out of abandonment, but by choice. A small plaque hung right in the centre of the wall. On it, engraved in brass, were a few words. There was silence here. And one day it broke. On the outskirts of the town, rumours about what happened in Bayswater Hall persisted. Some said that Lady Euphemia died of grief. Others that Elspeth's ghost had visited her one last time. Only a small group knew the truth, and none of them felt the need to explain it. Across the Channel in London, Hercule Poirot was writing a letter in black ink, a small, satisfied expression on his lips. The address was clear: Rue des Petits Champs, Paris. To my friends at Galerie Malory, here is a query not to solve a crime, but to preserve history. Do you still have the original sketch of the lady in the portrait? It would be a greater crime, this time an artistic one, to allow it to disappear again. And after sealing the envelope, Poirot allowed himself one last reflection. The air, after all, was not opened by a key, but by a woman who decided to no longer remain silent. That night, a light breeze swept through the halls of Bayswater Hall. It wasn't cold. It was moving, as if the house had finally begun to speak softly, and whoever lived there knew how to listen. Chapter 12. The Voices of the Silent Marble. The restoration of Bayswater Hall had begun, but not in the form of structural renovations. There were no bricklayers or labourers. What was being restored was deeper, more invisible. It was the connections, the history, and the memory. Under Caroline Rosendale's quiet but firm direction, the mansion was no longer a mausoleum of secrets, but a place of active repose. A stage where the past could finally settle without fear. But like any emotional restoration process, there were wounds that still throbbed. One of them was at the end of the North Corridor, in the former archive room. It had been Sir Alaric Rosendale's office, and later Julian's makeshift study. There, under a thick curtain of dust and between locked glass cabinets, Caroline found an object that, without looking for it, opened a new mystery to her. It was a marble sculpture, small, about the size of a pumpkin. It represented a female head, without carved eyes with a key instead of a tongue. The inscription on the base read, "Truth without a voice. Truth without voice." Caroline carried it to the music room and placed it on the piano, next to the key Poirot had left for her before leaving. This combination of objects, unwittingly, reawakened something dormant. That night she dreamed of Julian, of Euphemia, of a female voice repeating a phrase she could no longer ignore. Inheritance is not what you leave behind. It's what you force others to carry. The next morning, Caroline wrote a letter to the Historical Institute, not to send more documents, but to ask a question. Do you have a record of the whereabouts of Nicholas Renton's body? Has he been exhumed? Has he been positively identified? I'm afraid it wasn't him who died in 1932. A week later, the answer arrived. No, the body was identified by belongings, not by forensic evidence. The face was unrecognizable due to exposure to the sea. The case was closed by the testimony of a single witness, Samuel Renton. The blood froze in his veins. Hours later, Creighton found her standing in front of the fireplace, holding the letter. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking. She was just staring into the fire, as if it were the gateway to another truth she hadn't yet wanted to accept. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked with genuine concern. "No," she replied without looking up. "I think there's one more lie in this house, that same night Caroline went down to the basement alone. There, among forgotten boxes, she found a suitcase she didn't recognize. Inside it, crumpled papers, train tickets, and a British passport with the name Nicholas Renton. But the photograph was unmistakable. Samuel Renton. My God," he whispered. The doctor, the man they believed was Samuel, had actually been their cousin. Nicholas Renton, missing in the Mediterranean, had impersonated his relative. Perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of convenience, perhaps to erase a story that haunted him, and begin a new, more controlled one. He had returned from the sea, not as a victim, but as the author of a new fiction. He hid in plain sight. He inherited a name no one questioned. And slowly he crept closer to the Rosendales, not as a witness, but as a silent judge. Everything fit together. His obsession with Julian, his intimate access to Euphemia, his detailed knowledge of Elsbeth, and his talent for manipulating without leaving a trace. The crime Poirot had solved was only the second layer, and the final truth still remained unrevealed. Caroline closed her suitcase and stood alone in the darkness of the basement, embracing not fear, but clarity. The marble sculpture on the piano wasn't just an allegory, it was an omen. The voiceless truth had, in the end, spoken. It had screamed. Only those who heard it did so too late. He climbed the stairs slowly. Each step was a decision. When he reached his room, he turned on the lamp, took out a pen and paper, and wrote the last entry in Julian's diary, which until then he had left blank. The sea didn't take him away. The lie did, and I no longer carry what doesn't belong to me. Yes, the newspaper closed, and with that, for the first time in generations, the cycle also closed. In London, Hercule Poirot, sitting in front of a cup of hot chocolate, received Caroline's letter with the photograph. He looked at it silently, reading every line, and then placed it on the table without a word. With a sad smile he adjusted his moustache. "Ah, my dear Hastings, it seems the air still held one more secret." Chapter 13. The Words That Should Not Have Been Written. It was barely dawn in London when Hercule Poirot walked through the door of the Diogenes Club, a rare exception to his preference for livelier surroundings. He wasn't a man given to absolute silence, but in this case he needed the opposite of bustle, concentration. He had no company. He had no hat, only a leather briefcase closed with a brass clasp. Inside was an exact copy of Caroline's letter, and beneath it, the photograph. Poirot ordered a short espresso, the only thing on the menu that seemed truly European to him, and opened his notebook. The notes were not meant to deduce, but to confirm something he already knew. The question was not whether Samuel Renton was actually Nicholas Renton. The letter, the found passport, and the disappearance of Julian's face in the photo were enough evidence. The real question was, why take on such a life? Why infiltrate the Rosendales with a mask woven with guilt? The answer Poirot suspected, lay in the manuscript that Caroline hadn't sent him, but which he knew must exist. The second part of Julian's diary, the one that was never found. Or rather, the one that was carefully stolen before it could come to light. In Bayswater Hall, Caroline also had questions. The suitcase found in the basement had already been handed over to the police, but its contents still troubled her more than any signed confession. Among the papers was a loose sheet of paper, yellowed with age. It looked like it had been torn from a hand-bound notebook. On it, in faded blue ink, was the following: "Nick won't stand the silence any longer. Neither will I. But if anything happens to me, they'll know I didn't give up. The key isn't in the inheritance, it's in in the way he looks at me, in what he doesn't say." It wasn't signed, but Caroline knew that handwriting. She'd seen it in children's books, in notes tucked into history books, on gift tags. It was Julian's handwriting. So, had Nicholas, a.k.a. Samuel, read these words? Had he hidden them? Or had he simply lived with them, etched on his neck for years? That night, Caroline summoned the local inspector, not to declare another crime, but tore open a forgotten case. The sinking of the sailboat Lysandra, which occurred in 1932 in French waters. The ship where Julian supposedly died. Where Nicholas was reported missing, and later recognized as dead by his cousin Samuel. Only now everything was upside down. "I want the body they buried as Nicholas exhumed," Caroline said, her voice calm but determined. Or rather, as Samuel. The inspector looked at her suspiciously. "Are you sure, Miss Rosendale? It's a drastic step. After so many years, what was buried wasn't just a body. It was a lie. And I don't want to live on hollow earth any more." Meanwhile, in London, Poirot was about to meet with an old acquaintance, Professor Lemarchand, an expert in historical archives and genealogical documentation. They had worked together on the case of the 9 bridges of Marlow, and if anyone could track the legal movements between Nicholas and Samuel Renton, it was him. The conversation was brief. "Ah, the Rentons," Lemarchand said with a slight click of his tongue. "2 branches, a fortune diluted in debt, a rebellious son, and a brilliant but weak cousin. The classic identity swap scenario, only this time no witnesses, no trace of claimed inheritances. It's as if one has erased itself and the other has rewritten itself. And nothing recorded after 1932, just an ID purchase in Marseille. Fake, paid in cash, the name Samuel. Alaric Renton. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Alaric? Yes, same name as the Rosendale patriarch. The conclusion was clear. Nicholas Renton had not only assumed his cousin's life, he had re-entered Rosendale history as a redemptive shadow, a figure who would punish from within what his family had destroyed. A psychological echo, a crime that had taken 40 years to unfold. When Caroline received the news from London that same week, she wasn't surprised. Deep down, she already knew. The crime hadn't been identity theft. It wasn't even the manipulation of Euphemia. The crime was more complex. It was the decision to live as someone else, to force a family to remember those they had made disappear. And yet, twisted as he was, Nicholas, aka Samuel, had brought Elsbeth's name back into the world. He had made visible what had once been a shadow, not with nobility, but with determination. That night, in front of Elsbeth's restored portrait, Caroline left a white flower. "Thank you," he said softly, "to both of you, to the one who couldn't bear the weight, and to the one who lived to avenge it." And for the first time in Bayswater Hall, there was no silence, just a whisper coming down the stairs, light as air. Chapter 14. A voice signed in blood. The exhumation took place at dawn in the coastal Penhallock Cemetery, a place where cypress trees grew crooked in the wind and headstones leaned as if their occupants were still seeking rest. Caroline Rosendale watched silently as two uniformed workers, wearing grey gloves and restrained expressions, removed the compacted earth from an unadorned grave, marked simply Samuel Renton, 1909, 1932, "Let the sea take away what cannot be," said an epitaph that now seemed more like a warning than an elegy. When the coffin was finally opened and the forensic expert removed the remains in search of dental and bone confirmation, there was absolute silence, not out of respect, but out of tacit recognition. Everyone knew that the body wasn't who it was supposed to be. Days later, analysis confirmed what Poirot and Caroline already knew deep down. The body was Samuel Renton. The real Nicholas had survived, had returned, and had lived among them for over 40 years under his cousin's name. As a doctor, as a confidant, as a stealthy avenger. In London, Poirot received the telegram without surprise, only with resignation. He had unmasked criminals who killed out of jealousy, greed, or fear. But Nicholas Renton had committed a much stranger crime. He hadron accusation. It had become a living memory with a foreign face, a creature made of remorse and twisted justice. That night, Poirot wrote one last entry in his notebook. There are deaths that require investigation. There are others that require understanding. And then there are the deaths that were a lifetime. Renton didn't just change his name. He changed his punishment, and he lived in it, day after day. In Bayswater Hall, autumn was falling slowly, casting long shadows across the countryside. Caroline decided to open the Rosendale Gallery to the public for the first time in decades, not as a tribute to a noble family, but as a testament to a recovered history. In the main hall, right where the fake still life had once been, now hung the portrait of Elsbeth Marston, accompanied by a plaque. The one that was hidden, the one who never asked for revenge, she who, without a voice, spoke. At the opening, the guests murmured among themselves, some with discomfort, others with genuine curiosity. But everyone felt the invisible presence of something that had finally taken shape. After the event, Caroline returned to the library. On the desk, a wooden box Creighton had discovered while cleaning out an antique music cabinet was waiting. Inside were letters, dozens, all written by Julian, all addressed to someone named Nick. "I wanted to tell you that I forgave you, but I know that's not enough. The sea didn't drown us. It was the silence that separated us." Caroline let the box rest in her hands. Then, carefully, she began sorting the letters by date, not to hand them over to the police, not to hide them, but to preserve them. This isn't evidence, he said quietly. It's a correspondence between a wound and its scar. A week later, a sealed envelope arrived at Poirot's door. Inside, a signed invitation. The Elsbeth Marston Gallery opens its doors on November 12. If you still trust the little grey cells, you might want to come see the place where a woman was finally heard. C.R. Poirot was silent. Then he smiled. Not a smile of triumph, but of repose. Finally, a place where even shadows can sit and have tea. That November, when the Belgian detective crossed the threshold of the restored gallery, dressed in his grey wool coat and carrying his gleaming cane, he knew immediately that he hadn't come to close a case. I had come to see how a story could become justice without the need for punishment. And in front of Elsbeth's portrait, next to the golden key, and the sculpture once called the Voiceless Truth, Poirot bowed slightly. Mademoiselle, justice has been done, not the justice of the courts, but that of memories. And so, in the last room of Bayswater Hall, an echo found its destiny. Not the echo of a voice, but of a choice. Chapter 15. The Notebook That Was Never Published. Winter came to Cornwall with velvet steps. The wind no longer roared as before, nor did the rain beat violently against the windows of Bayswater Hall. The house, renovated from the inside out, had learned the art of whispering. It didn't need absolute silence, just a chosen one. Voluntary. Caroline Rosendale now spent her days between the public gallery and the family library, where she continued sorting through the documents in the Rosendale Marston archive. Not out of obligation, out of dignity. She had renounced the glorious version of her name to embrace the true one, a broken story, pieced together with truth, guilt, unspoken love, and death. One grey afternoon, while sorting letters with Creighton, something fell out of the false bottom of a green leather-bound folder. A notebook, small, covered in dark linen. Untitled, "One more?" Creighton asked, his voice resigned. Caroline didn't respond. She sat in her usual chair, the notebook on her knees. When she opened it, she realized it wasn't Julian's, nor Euphemia's. It was from Nicholas. I was never the strong one. Julian shone, and I followed his shadow. I didn't hate it, but I couldn't hold it either. When the sea took Sam, I was scared. I thought they'd arrest me. That they'd say it was my fault. Maybe it was, maybe not. On the coast, with the papers mixed up and Sam's face unrecognizable, I had the opportunity, and I took it. Being Samuel Renton didn't give me power. It gave me access. To Julian, to Euphemia, to the crack where justice can be done without firing a single bullet. Caroline turned the pages slowly. The words weren't dramatic. They were precise, cold, full of the twisted logic of someone who had turned regret into purpose. I know I will die before my time, not from revenge, from exhaustion. Living another life is burdensome. It's like pretending you don't exist, and then asking to be remembered. But if someone ever finds this, they'll know it wasn't out of hate. It was for Elsbeth, by Julian, for what was not said, and for what you never wanted to write. Caroline closed the notebook with trembling hands, not out of fear, not even out of surprise. but because of the final confirmation of what she had always suspected since Poirot left the house with that silent look. Renton hadn't died innocent, but he hadn't lived guilty either. That night, Caroline wrote 2 letters. The first, addressed to Inspector Doyle's office, requested that the notebook be omitted from the official case records, not out of cover-up, but out of mercy. The crime had already been atoned for with a lifetime. The second, sent to London. Dear Monsieur Poirot, he wrote it down. Everything. He wasn't looking for redemption or apologies, just memory. I've left the notebook in safe deposit box number 7 at the Diogenes Club, with your name on it. If you want to keep it, please do so. If you want to destroy it, too. But if you ever decide to write about this case, let it be about the key, not the lock. With respect, C. Rosendale. A few days later, Poirot showed up at the club. The box was waiting for him. He opened the notebook without ceremony and read it over the course of an afternoon. He made no notes. He didn't quote it. He just closed it slowly. In his hotel room that night, he took out his finest pen and wrote a single line on the back of an empty envelope. Some crimes don't require punishment, only memory. Then he put the notebook in a drawer in his desk, locked it, a small gold key that opened nothing but an empty box except for the memory, and turned off the light. Bayswater Hall. She was still standing, lighter, more present. People were no longer talking about the woman who died in front of a non-existent painting, but about the gallery where a forgotten woman had finally been portrayed with justice. Caroline, passing by Elsbeth's portrait, would sometimes stop, not to pray, not to cry, just to nod, like someone who has listened and responded. Chapter 16. The Portrait That Was Never Painted. February brought unusually light snow to Cornwall, covering the gardens of Bayswater Hall, with a veil of whiteness that seemed to erase for a few hours everything history had accumulated. The mansion slept more than it lived on those cold days, with sporadic visits to the gallery, and a silence that no longer weighed as heavily as before. It was a different silence, that of things understood. Caroline Rosendale, wrapped in a dark blue cloak, stood in her Uncle Julian's studio, a place he had now turned into his little refuge. On the table, besides the papers from the family archive, lay something new, blank canvases. Because Caroline, who had never had a calling as an artist, had begun painting, not to exhibit, not to restore, but as a way to record what words couldn't name. Her first attempt, however, baffled her, the portrait of Nicholas Renton. He had tried to sketch him with the precision he retained in his memory. The restrained face, the distant gaze, the always neatly trimmed moustache. But the result, time, and again seemed incomplete. Something essential was missing, not in the stroke, in the expression, in the intention. How do you portray a man who lived as someone else? He whispered, gazing at the unfinished painting. She closed her brushes and went out into the hallway. It was still difficult for her to spend too much time in the studio without hearing Julian's echoes lurking in the walls. Sometimes, in the golden afternoon light, she thought she heard the faint melody of a piece her uncle used to play on the piano, although she knew no one else in the house remembered it. As she passed the gallery, she saw an elderly woman looking at the portrait of Elspeth Marston. She was wearing a modest hat and an old-fashioned wool coat. When Caroline approached her, the visitor gave her an unexpectedly serene smile. "I didn't know her, of course," the woman said, without Caroline having to ask. "But the way she's portrayed, she seems like she could talk, like she still has something to say." Caroline smiled. Not fake, but genuine. Maybe he never stopped doing it. We just didn't know how to listen. The woman said goodbye shortly after, but her words remained echoing. That night in the studio, Caroline returned to the unfinished portrait. She looked at it for a long time, without touching it. Then, with steady hands, she took the brush and dipped it in a very pale blue, not to finish the face, not to define the eyes, but to do the unthinkable. He painted a key on the canvas, small, golden, hanging from the neck of a faceless man whose figure was only sketched out. It was their way of recording not the man, but what he represented. A warning, a testimony, a judgment, and a sacrifice all at once. In London, Hercule Poirot received an envelope with no return address. Inside, a photo of the new painting and a note. "I couldn't finish his face. It doesn't belong to me. But the key does. Thanks for spinning it." Poirot left it on his desk. He looked at it silently. Then he opened his casebook and wrote one last sentence beneath the title, "The Key That Opened the Air." In the end, the most accurate portrait is one that only suggests, because the truth is not always painted. Sometimes it is only hinted at. Bayswater Hall closed its doors to the public in March, not because of tragedy, but because of renovation. The gallery would be restructured to include a new wing. Portraits Without a Name, an exhibition of incomplete figures, faces in progress, fragmented identities. Because Caroline had understood that sometimes what is never finished is what lasts the longest, and in the last room, under a soft light, his most enigmatic painting was exhibited, The Man with the Key. He had no face, but everyone who saw him somehow recognized him. Chapter 17. The Ashes of Truth. April brought the sound of buds, as if the earth finally wanted to whisper back. Bayswater Hall, now officially registered as a site of historical interest, was beginning to receive not only visitors, but also researchers, artists and distant descendants who came, looking for fragments of memory. The story of Elspeth Marston had appeared in a cultural supplement of the Times, under the headline, The Woman Who Came Back from the Air. Caroline Rosendale had allowed that publication. But what she hadn't allowed, and wouldn't allow, was the inclusion of Nicholas Renton by name. In the records, he remained a man who took one life to unearth another. Anonymous by choice, recognized by consequence. That day, as the final details for the gallery's new wing were being finalized, Caroline received a letter marked with the Rosendale family notary's seal. Inside, with typical formality, she was informed that Euphemia's final wishes, in her oldest and never amended will, included a sealed envelope with specific instructions. An envelope that had never been opened. That night, Caroline carried in to Julian's desk, lit the oil lamp, and opened it with hands that were no longer shaking. Inside was a sheet of paper written in her aunt's recognizable handwriting, and a small sealed gold locket. "Dear Caroline, if you're reading this, it's because everything has come to light. There's something I could never confess in life. Maybe because I didn't know how. Maybe because I was afraid of what you would say about me. Julian wasn't raised on lies. He was loved with a mission. He knew about Elsbeth long before I did. He taught me to see through judgment, and just when I thought I'd lost him. I also lost my chance at redemption. This locket was hers. I kept it out of selfishness. I didn't want anyone else to have it, but now he must return to history. With love, Euphemia." Caroline opened the locket. Inside was a miniature even older than the portrait found. Elsbeth, much younger, without a key around her neck, without sadness on her face. Only hope, and on the back, a line written in faded ink. "May my voice, if not heard, at least be contained." Caroline closed the locket and placed it on the piano, next to the painting of the man with the key. It was the first time the two objects had been together. Days later, Poirot returned for the last time to Bayswater Hall. Not to investigate, not to close anything. Simply as a visitor, he was greeted with hot tea and absolute respect. No one else asked him what he had solved. The story, already known, now had its own guardians. That afternoon, Caroline took him to the room where the new painting hung, next to the locket. "Do you think she's at peace now?" he asked. Poirot looked at her kindly. "Mademoiselle Peace isn't found in what we leave behind. It's found in what we no longer need to hide. And Nicholas, he suffered more than anyone, but he chose not revenge, representation, and that's more complex, lonelier, and more noble than many would believe." Caroline nodded. Then she held something out. A jar. The ashes of his diary. I burned them, not out of hatred, but because he didn't want to be a biography. Just an impulse. Poirot took the bottle in his hands. "All right, sometimes the most honourable thing to do with a truth is to let it burn." That evening, in the back garden, in front of a dried-up fig tree that Euphemia had planted in her youth, Caroline and Poirot scattered the ashes without ceremony. The wind carried them effortlessly, not upwards, but to the sides, as if history didn't wish to ascend, but extend. As he said goodbye at the door of the gallery, Poirot took a moment to look at the facade. "And now, mademoiselle, what will you do with this place?" Caroline smiled. "I'll let him talk, without being forced, without covering it up. Just let him talk." Poirot bowed his head respectfully. Then he walked slowly away, his silhouette disappearing into the light mist that fell like a curtain over the final scene. In the living room, Elsbeth's figure watched from the canvas, and in the next room, the portrait of the faceless man held a key that no longer had a destination because he had fulfilled it. Final chapter. The key that opened the air. London spring. The city was waking up under a clear, unashamed sky. In his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot arranged the ingredients for his breakfast with mathematical precision. 2 slices of toast, unsalted butter, a cup of hot chocolate, and an apple cut into 8 exactly equal pieces. That morning, however, he didn't play any of them. He stood in front of the window, holding a thick paper letter, written in blue ink. It wasn't long, but it contained just the right words to conclude a chapter deeper than any he'd solved with his usual method of deduction. Mr. Poirot, the portrait has been removed, not destroyed nor hidden. Simply returned to silence. There are things that should not be hung on walls, but kept in memory. Elspeth's locket has been given to the St. Ives Museum, and the key, as you advised, now rests in the unmarked display case. Visitors look at it with curiosity, and no one asks what it opens. That's victory, isn't it? CR. Poirot closed his eyes. In his career, he had unmasked murderers, exposed frauds, solved impossible problems. But the key that opened the airite wasn't a crime like any other. There was no murder, at least not in the way the penal code understood it, just an act sustained over years, assuming the face of another so that a silenced past could finally speak. Nicholas Renton wasn't a martyr, nor a monster. He was a figure constructed from the very chasm of family history, and in its most perverse form, he delivered justice. Poirot opened his notebook and wrote the last entry in the case. Case, the key that opened the heir conclusion. A crime without a body, a murderer without a crime, a victim who didn't know it, and a house that breathed. Under the guilt accumulated by generations, what this key opened was not a door. It was the conscience. In Cornwall, Bayswater Hall remained open, albeit without fanfare. The gallery now functioned as a changing space. Temporary exhibitions, lectures, workshops on historical memory were held. Caroline Rosendale no longer lived there. She had transferred ownership to the Regional Cultural Heritage Trust and moved to a small house by the sea. A house with no pictures hanging on it, no display cases, just large windows overlooking the Atlantic. One afternoon in May, he sat by the sea with a blank notebook. He had bought new pens, not to write fiction, but to record things that would not enter any official archive. Wrote, not all truths should be known, but they must understand each other, and that only happens when we stop looking for someone to blame, and start listening to those who never spoke. He closed the notebook. That same evening he received a final letter from Poirot. Mademoiselle Rosendale, thank you for trusting my little grey cells, but most of all, for trusting yours. Stories don't end with a resolution. They end when someone decides not to continue telling them to justify themselves, but to free themselves. You've done it, and now he can live. H.P. The key now, on display under glass in the museum, had a simple plaque, object without a lock, found in a story that decided to speak. The visitors, as Caroline predicted, did not ask questions, but sometimes a curious child would stop in front of her and ask his mother, what if he does open something? The mother used to smile. Maybe, but not a door. And somewhere in London, Poirot folded his handkerchief neatly, carefully put on his bowler hat, and went for a walk in the park, not in search of mysteries, but to celebrate that, at least once, he had solved one that didn't require handcuffs, just understanding.